Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're going to discuss about 10 ways in which you can almost kill orchids. But not to worry, I will give you the fix for them as well. Now, if you've ever in your life killed an orchid, don't worry about it. We all did, whether we like to admit it or not. But the important thing is to learn from this experience so that it will never happen again. So without further ado, here are the 10 most common ways in which people kill orchids. So method number 1 in which you can kill an orchid, through root rot. Now, if you've already read up a little bit on orchids, you might already know that over-watering, which refers to watering too often, can cause root rot and kill an orchid. Well, the truth is that while water helps, it's not actually the reason why roots rot. The rotting is just a side effect of orchid roots dying. And because the roots can die of various reasons, root rot can be achieved in quite a few ways. One of the ways is through suffocation. Orchids in general, at least the ones that we can grow, are epiphytic in nature. This means their roots are not buried underground, but they live in the air. We can think of them as air plants. Roots can easily get suffocated in improper medium. Very compacted sphagnum moss doesn't allow for pockets of air. Also, very degraded medium, even if it's bark or coconut husk, can have the same effect. Water helps because it further reduces the air pockets. But moreover, water is the perfect medium for fungi or bacteria or other pathogens to thrive. If you water organic mediums such as bark chips, coconut husk, or sphagnum moss too often, you are speeding up the degradation. A way to fix this is, of course, to repot your orchid in time. The usual life of this medium is between 1 and 3 years, depending on the quality, of course. But especially with new orchids that have been sitting in the same medium for a few years, it's really important to repot the orchid in time before the medium starts to break down and become compacted. Broken down medium can kill roots also through its acidity. With decomposition processes, CO2 is released as well, and it influences the overall pH, making it acidic. If the medium is too broken down, it can start to burn the roots. The outcome is pretty much the same. The roots get affected, they die, and then they start to decompose and rot. In this case, yet again, the solution is just to repot the orchid in time. If you have a few dead roots, it's a very good idea to cut them before you put the orchid in fresh medium. Dead roots can further acidify even fresh medium and have a negative impact on the healthy roots. Okay, the second most common way to kill an orchid is through crown rot. In this case, we are dealing with a fungal or bacterial infection in the crown of an orchid, and we usually refer to monopodial orchids such as Phalaenopsis, Vandas, and other orchids which don't have pseudobulbs or fans, but rather have one single stem that creates leaves on each side. The top of the orchid is called the crown, and it's a pretty sensitive place. Crown rot is severe damage of the crown due to infection, and as you might suspect, the orchid cannot produce any more leaves from the top, therefore it cannot grow. But not only, the infection can spread through the stem all the way to the roots and completely kill off the orchid if left untreated. But it's not a deadly disease if you manage to spot it in time. Being that crown rot is usually a fungal infection, fungicides can work very well. However, if you're not a fan of fungicides, you can definitely use some household products, and I'll link you down below in the description to my recipe of curing crown rot, which has always worked for me. Mind you, it only depends on how advanced the infection is. But what causes it? Well, actually, water. Due to the way we grow monopodial orchids, usually upright, water tends to pool in the crown due to the orchid's shape and how the leaves are arranged. So being careful not to let water sit in the crown for too long is the best way to prevent crown rot. As I was saying, the crown is a very sensitive tissue to the orchid, and if water stays too long, it can accumulate bacteria and fungi, which will develop really fast in water. Due to the shape of the crown, water can actually go deep into the stem. The crown is actually like a funnel, and sometimes it can go so deep that you cannot remove it. But in many cases, you can actually remove the water in the crown. Simply get a paper tissue or a napkin and remove as much of the pool as you can. Folding the tissue in a pretty sharp edge will help you get pretty deep into the crown. And no matter how much you push, the tissue will not damage the crown. So press a thin sheet of tissue inside the crown and just let it be. It will soak up the water pretty fast. But the best way is to avoid crown rot completely. This infection is more prone to appear in colder climates or colder seasons. Due to lower temperatures, water doesn't evaporate fast, and the longer it stays, the more bacteria and fungi it accumulates. Now, crown rot is a disease specific to cultivation, as I was saying, due to the way we usually grow orchids. In nature, crown rot is easily avoided due to the placement of the orchid, which is not vertical, but rather horizontal. So orchids usually grow leaning downwards on a tree or a rock, so the water just slides off, preventing a big pool of water in the crown. Third way in which you can almost kill an orchid is through sunburn. Orchids are not great at handling direct hot sun, especially if the temperature in their environment is high as well. Unlike other plants, they cannot tolerate high temperatures of the leaves. So when the leaf gets really hot, well, then the tissue starts to get damaged as well. And the worst part is that it's irreversible. In extreme cases, an orchid can lose all of its leaves, and this can only mean one thing: the orchid cannot feed herself, because the leaves are the kitchen of the orchid. It's where photosynthesis takes place and where nutritious sap is produced. All orchids are prone to having sunburn, even highlight orchids if they're not gradually adapted to higher and higher intensities of the sun. Also, if the environment is way too hot, even highlight orchids can get burned. In the description below, I'll add some links to some videos that elaborate the subject a little more, and also some cases that I had, so you can see how severe sunburn looks like. The best thing to do is to avoid it. Do not place your orchids in direct sun straight away. For the highlight orchids, it's always better to put them in bright light or filtered sun, and then, if you think they can handle direct sunshine, move them closer and closer to the window or to the sunny space. But let's say that you already managed to burn the leaves on your orchid. Well, you will need to be patient, because the orchid lost all of her leaves, she will be set back. And this means a slow recovery, but recoveries can happen. You can choose to either cut away the leaves, or you can choose to leave them be. Usually they dry up on their own, and when they're dry, they come right off, already with a sealed edge. Next thing you can do is actually allow the roots to have access to light. The main function of the leaves is to photosynthesize, but the roots can photosynthesize as well, not to such an extent as the leaves, but they can definitely help the orchid, producing the elaborated sap the orchid needs to grow. So if you keep your orchid in a transparent pot and then a decorative pot, just remove it from the decorative pot. You don't need to provide direct sunshine to the roots, but letting them have access to light can help a little bit. Now, don't expect the orchid will bounce back overnight. As I was saying, roots are not supposed to be the main structures that photosynthesize. The new leaves that will be produced will be quite small, or in case of sympodials, the new pseudobulbs. You just have to have some patience. The orchid needs some photosynthesizing structures first before it can reach the normal size it can grow to. But try to be patient, care for the orchid properly, and each new structure will be bigger than the other one. Fourth way to kill an orchid is to actually dehydrate them. As opposed to root rot, water here is provided in less quantities or less often than it should be provided. Now, some articles suggest that orchids should be watered once a week, once every 2 weeks, but the truth of the matter is, there is no set time in which you should water your orchid. It has to do with many things, starting from your environment, how cold it is, how hot or humid it is, and then with the medium, is it water retentive or rather fast drying? It can also relate to your orchid. If it has a lot of roots, the pot will dry up faster. So when you should water the orchid strictly relates to your particular case. But the rule is, never let an orchid bone dry for many days. The result of that is dead roots. If orchid roots don't get hydrated regularly, they will die off. And the result is very similar to root rot. So in this case, just like with root rot, a repot is actually needed. And this is because you need to cut away the already dead roots. If you leave them inside, they will start to decompose and eventually spoil the medium. Leave on the orchid only the live roots and make sure that you hydrate them regularly. The orchid medium doesn't need to stay soggy, but it doesn't mean it needs to stay bone dry for extended periods of time either. A recovering orchid will need to be kept hydrated a little bit better than a perfectly healthy orchid because it doesn't have enough roots to properly hydrate all its structures. So make sure that you provide adequate fresh medium and you water rather when the medium is almost dry rather than completely bone dry. Fifth way to almost kill orchids is to burn their root system with the use of fertilizer. Now, orchids do indeed need fertilizer, but unlike other plants, they don't need high quantities of it. On the market, there are a ton of orchid fertilizers, and it's best to use them over an all-purpose fertilizer. And even with orchid fertilizers, it's always better to start safe and with lower quantities. If you know you're using tap water or a source of water that is a little hard, use half the quantity recommended on the label. And from there on, you can see how your orchid behaves and if what you are providing is enough, or you can go a little bit stronger. But let's just presume that you've already over-fertilized. You fertilized either too often or used a bigger quantity of fertilizer than you should have. Well, depends on the extent of the damage. Root burn usually manifests as pretty brown or dark patches on the roots. In extreme cases, the entire velamen of the roots will be very dark. The way to correct this depends on your particular situation, so I'll just give you a few examples. Let's say you have a light damage and the medium of your orchid is pretty fresh. In this case, you don't need to repot the orchid. All you need to do is flush the medium. The best way to flush the excessive salt in orchid medium is by soaking. So find a container or a decorative pot which can hold the orchid pot inside. It is better to use very soft water. So for this case, it's a good idea to go and buy distilled water if you don't already have a source of soft water in the house. Fill the decorative container to the brim of the orchid pot with soft water and let the orchid sit for around 15 minutes. Then remove the orchid, let excessive water drain out, and pour out the water in the decorative pot. Repeat the process another 2 times, and this will make sure that you are eliminating a great deal of salts already deposited inside the medium. From this moment on, you can correct the dosage and make sure that flushes, not necessarily with distilled water, are done regularly. Once a month is good to flush your orchid, even with tap water if it's not hard water, even if you just run water through the pot, and this will keep you a little safer from root damage. But in case you have severe root burn, and many roots are already affected, and you can also see rotting roots inside the medium, it's a good idea to repot your orchid. It's also a good idea to completely change the medium because if the damage is so big, chances are there are a lot of salts already inside the medium, and sometimes it becomes hard to remove them. So I would just remove the medium, offer fresh medium, cut away all of the dead roots and leave only the live roots. It's a good idea to also rinse a little bit under the faucet the existing live roots and then just repot the orchid and adjust the fertilizer scheme. Sixth way you can almost kill orchids is to separate their structures individually, and this applies more to sympodial orchids. A sympodial orchid is one that creates a rhizome and new pseudobulbs or fans each year or multiple times a year. Phalaenopsis orchids and Vanda orchids are not sympodial. Some of us have an urge to separate these structures, and I can understand it. You might think that each structure is actually a baby plant. Well, in fact, it's not. All of these structures combined form an orchid. They are not individual plants that can be cut and then propagated. So the best thing to do is not to do it. But let's just say you've already separated the pseudobulbs. The orchid is not necessarily dead, but it really depends on what you separated. If you separated tiny little seedling structures, then there is a high chance they will die. If you've cut one of the middle pseudobulbs that already has nice leaves, a nice size, and maybe even roots, then you might be able to save the orchid. If you cut new growth that is developing, such as this, definitely it will end up dead because nothing is actually formed. No leaves, no pseudobulb to store any nutrients, and no roots to absorb water. But let's say that you cut away a pseudobulb that is pretty mature, has some roots and some nice leaves already developed. In this case, you can actually pot it separate and maintain humidity high around it. If you cannot maintain high humidity around the plant, then try to maintain the medium moist at all times. Since there are no back structures to store energy and water, the orchid will need more water than usual, even if it's an orchid that doesn't like to stay moist all the time. With a bit of luck, what will happen is that this pseudobulb will create another growth of its own. Due to the lack of energy, the new growth will probably be very small, but it is able to produce a root system and leaves, and with a bit of patience and TLC, this orchid can form a complete orchid. The process will obviously be pretty slow, so expect smaller structures at first, but each new structure should be larger than the previous one, and in the end up with quite a few pseudobulbs that form an orchid. Seventh way in which you can almost kill an orchid is by cutting the leaves. Why would you want to cut the leaves? Well, maybe they have a few spots that you really don't like. If the leaf doesn't have a serious infection that spreads through the orchid, there's really no reason to cut the leaf, unless the vast majority of it is already dry. Leaves are a vital organ of an orchid. They photosynthesize and produce the elaborated sap, which actually feeds the orchid. So if you remove all of the leaves, the orchid will not be able to produce enough energy in order to grow. So the best thing to do is to assess the health of your orchid. If you see a few spots that are not putting the life of your orchid in danger, just leave the leaves be. Wait for the orchid to create multiple leaves, and after a while, when you can make sure that removing one leaf will not impact the health of the orchid, you can just remove it then. But let's say you've already removed all of the leaves on your orchid, and this can be a monopodial or a sympodial orchid. What you should do next is again to remove the orchid from its decorative container and let the roots photosynthesize. Yet again, they cannot take the place of the leaves, but they will help a little bit. So you can expect new growths to be smaller indeed, but with the help of the roots, they can actually develop faster than they would if the roots did not receive light. And yet again, it's a matter of having some patience. The orchid will definitely be set back, but with each new growth that has leaves, the next one will be bigger and bigger if you take care of your orchid properly. Eighth way in which you can almost kill an orchid is by trimming the root system. Just like the leaves, roots are a vital component of the orchid. But in this case, it's not that they will not photosynthesize, but they will not absorb water and nutrients for the leaves to use in photosynthesis and other functions. Now, why would people want to cut away roots? Well, it's a bit more common than you would think. The orchid doesn't fit in the pot anymore. Phalaenopsis orchids or Vanda orchids are not very prone to losing the entire root system, but they might indeed lose a few roots. When you cut a root, you make an open wound, and through that wound, all sorts of pathogens can enter. So even if you might not kill the entire root system, it's still pretty dangerous to cut away a lot of roots. In the case of Callia orchids and even other orchids, things are even worse. They are not prone to save their roots and branch out. They're actually prone to kill their roots. If you cut away the roots of a Callia orchid, chances are the entirety of that root will die off as well. So imagine you cut all of the tips of the roots that didn't fit the pot. That root system will completely die off most probably. So in a month or so, you will start to feel a very bad smell from the medium. And if you have a transparent pot, you will observe the roots starting to get very dark and very mushy. And this is because they're dead. So just like in the case of root rot, you need to unpot the orchid and cut away all of the dead roots. If the medium is already spoiled, you need to offer fresh medium. And yet again, because you removed a vital organ of the orchid, it will be set back, meaning the new growths will be tinier, the orchid might get completely dehydrated, pseudobulbs will shrivel, if some shrivel too much, they will completely be lost, even leaves can be lost if they get very desiccated, and in extreme cases, orchids can actually die. Ninth way in which you can almost kill an orchid is by keeping it too hot or too cold. Extreme temperatures can have a really negative impact on orchids. Hot temperatures can favor sunburn because they encourage overheating of the leaf. They can also help with dehydrating an orchid. On the other hand, colder temperatures can favor fungal infections. If not careful, you can even obtain root rot due to cold temperatures. And not only, if the leaves or other tissues of the plants start to die off in sections, those sections can actually get infected, and the infection can travel through the orchid and in the end entirely kill it off. So the best thing to do is to maintain your orchid within its required temperatures. But if you already have an orchid suffering from cold damage or heat damage, immediately relocate the orchid, cut away any leaf that you think is already infected with a bacterial or fungal infection. Make sure that the roots are properly hydrated. You can even soak an orchid in case of severe dehydration. And from there on, just care for the orchid as best as you can. You might observe that parts of the roots died, in which case you need to repot it, cut away all of the dead roots, maybe even replace the medium, or you might discover that the orchid will start to look better and better. So again, it depends on the case, but make sure that the temperatures in which you keep your orchids are correct. And the 10th way in which you can almost kill orchids is by ignoring them. You might already know that some people grow orchids by the motto, set it and forget it. Well, it doesn't really work all that much. And if you ever hear somebody saying, I ignore my orchid all the time and everything is going great, just give them time. In most cases, something bad will happen eventually. So why shouldn't we ignore orchids? Well, obviously, if we don't even look at them for days or weeks, all the first 5 ways in which you can potentially kill an orchid will most probably kill an orchid. Any infection or ailment has greater chances to be treatable if you spot it in time. If you don't look at your orchid for a week and a half, then maybe the crown rot advanced to the stem of the orchid until the root system, case in which the orchid is dead. If you don't notice that the roots are getting burned by the fertilizer, you will not have a few roots burned, you'll have all of them burned. If you don't notice that your orchid is getting scorched by the sun, in a few days, not only a few leaves will be affected, but all of them, and not only, maybe the axis as well, or the pseudobulbs, or the entire rhizome. But you can also miss pest infestation and who knows what other diseases. So it's a good idea to check on your orchids, at least give them a look once every day or every 2 days at least. So if you will, the best way to prevent anything is by giving your orchids attention. Alrighty, so these are the 10 most common ways to almost kill an orchid. But you know us, we're creative, and I'm sure there are a whole lot of other ways in which you can almost kill orchids. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, but before I let you go, let's play a little game of fill in the blanks. So I'll give you a sentence and I'll leave an open space, and what you need to do is complete the sentence in the comments down below. You can be as funny, ironic, sarcastic, and creative as you like. So next week in one of my future videos, I'll pick my favorite answers and I'll feature them in a video. So the sentence today is, my orchid was doing fine, but then, and here is where you need to fill in the blank. So I'm really curious what your answers will be, and I'm sure we'll all have a great laugh. Alrighty, so thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. You know the drill. If you liked this video, then give it a like. If you didn't like it, give it a dislike. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchids and other plants videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!